Please be advised that this podcast was made for fun and to share the general experiences of two criminal lawyers in Toronto. You must not take anything you hear in this episode as legal advice. Every situation for every person is different, and you should always consult with a lawyer for legal advice specific to you and your circumstances.
Welcome back, everybody, to our third episode now of Justice Redefined, a podcast brought to you by me, Kabir, Sharma, partner at Titan Defence LLP, and
Sina Shabestary, partner and criminal defense lawyer at Titan Defence LLP. And today we've got a very special guest for you that we're very, very excited about. Lee, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Chapelle, and I am a former criminal/convict inmate, and for the last 11 years have been the founder and president of Canadian Prison Consulting Incorporated.
All right, so very briefly, what does Canadian Prison Consulting Incorporated do? We'll get into more detail on it a bit later, but just briefly, just for an intro to get people kind of understanding what you do.
Yeah, whenever I note that I'm a prison consultant, inevitably, no matter who I'm talking to, that begs the question of what does that mean? In a nutshell, I would say if it ran exactly the way I wanted to with every case, what I would script would be client would be on bail, first-time offender. I would meet always at the front end and do a 2 to 3 to 5 hour long consult with the person facing incarceration, conviction, their support people, and I would get a real good insight into who they are, what brought them to where they are, and I delve into things such as mitigating factors, insight, remorse, ownership. I don't take all clients on. I have a unique business where I tend to have more people come at me than I can take on at a time. And often through defense counsel referrals. Mm-hmm. And what we provide in a nutshell is laying the foundation for early conditional release aspirations down the road.
Okay.
And that entails what I would call almost a parallel to a PSR, only one that...
And just for the people that don't know, a PSR is a pre-sentence report that's written by a probation officer that a judge reads prior to sentencing somebody that's found guilty.
Right. And I'm not a fan of PSRs. Frankly, I think there's a lot of power put into a young probation and parole officer's hands from very brief interviews that could be misconstrued, misinterpreted, and then, captured, and it could end up being. So we prep for that if that's happening as well.
Okay.
Keys that I encourage my clients to be and their support, because they speak with support people in pre-sentence reports as well, not to minimize, not to deflect, to take ownership, to be accountable, and to be really clear that they may be friendly and they may encourage you to be, but ultimately you just need to really stay on point with your messaging, and you need to be clear that you have remorse and that you are working to find insight into what led to where you are, what the mitigating factors were. And these are the things that essentially we flush out very thoroughly through support letters to the court. Even if there's a joint submission, I work with a client and their support people I come up with, after the extensive consult, I draft a unique case-specific circumstance guideline to the community supporters with suggested formatting, content, not verbatim, of course, but things to touch upon to paint this person in the light of outside of the one thing that they did that brought them to the courtroom. And as we know, crowns tend to want to paint them all in that light.
For sure.
Provide all other context.
So before we get into the nitty gritty, I think one thing is that we hope that at least our listeners are kind of a mix of lawyers, but more importantly, lay people. Right. So I just want to lay the foundation a little bit on what it is that we're talking about here. First and foremost, are you getting involved with individuals who have been charged pre or post conviction?
I do both.
Okay.
And again, what I said, I think at the front end of that was ideally it would be pre.
Got it. So, and then just so that our listeners are aware of what it was you're talking about. So, for example, when you're talking about a joint submission, we're talking about counsel coming forward and making their submissions on sentence as to what the judge should do on sentencing. And for the listeners, joint submissions mean that both the defense as well as the Crown agree to what the appropriate sentence should be. And it's very seldomly not imposed. In other words, the court will usually, more often than not, go along with joint submissions. So before I think we kind of get into more technical stuff, Lee, tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us about your life.
I mean, Lee, you spoke a lot about what gets people into the situations that you're in, who you represent. And all of you indicated that you're a former criminal and convict. And I think it's, everyone's curious about, what led you there. So can you tell us a bit about, where you grew up and how your life was early on, and maybe what led you to end up making bad decisions that put you in unenviable positions?
And how you turned that around too.
And what led me to doing what I'm doing now. Sure. Short version. In reference to what I just shared, I'm coming from a position of a lot of lived experience, having been in their shoes. I'm nobody to judge, first and foremost. I've made probably more mistakes than 99% of people. So I have that luxury of not being judgmental and understanding how things can go wrong. I was born in Toronto in 1967. Which might as well be the 1800s. At this point, things have changed quite a bit. But I was born, and I found this. The only thing I found out about my natural parents or my family was through a non-identifying package through the Children's Aid Society in my early 30s. And I had a mother who, I guess, was a drug addict and a prostitute, and had entered into an agreement to fulfill her term of pregnancy and immediately relinquish me to the Children's Aid Society. So I was, I've often coined the phrase, I was born to the custody of the Children's Aid Society, which is somewhat accurate. Yeah. And my first 14 months were spent in various foster care homes. Mm-hmm. I have no insight into that. There's no record of it that I can find. And I was adopted at 14 months, and that adoption broke down by the time I was pre-adolescence. So they essentially said, well, we don't want you anymore. Went back to the group home foster care. So I grew up in child welfare.
So that would have been what, in and around 8 or 9 years, the first adoption?
It ended, around the late 70s. So in the early 80s, I was back into the child welfare system in the group homes.
And what I don't understand, Lee, is maybe you don't know about this, but once you adopt a child, you can just, give them back?
I don't know the legislation, and I don't know the policy. I've not researched it, but I can say that yes, that there was a point where I was getting in trouble, and from my understanding of it at this point, it was facilitated where I ended up going back to a group home, and there was no further contact from that family that I had known to be my family when I grew up.
Right. So you were getting in trouble even at the age of 8 and 9? Yeah? Can you give me an example of what kind of things that you would get in trouble for?
Yeah, I mean, I was, I guess today, if it was today's day and age, I probably would have been diagnosed as ADHD in a classroom. I wasn't, I had all these tests that were done that said I had a high intellect, yet I had no ability to concentrate. I mean, all these different terms. And I began stealing also from variety stores, like chocolate bars, things like that. Got caught a couple times. It was, ironically, when I've had a lot of time to look at this from a big picture perspective and look back at it. And the one thing that I've come to note is that child welfare, poverty backgrounds tend to lead to a high percentage of the people who are incarcerated in our jails and prisons today, right? As opposed to the nuclear family and strong, intact families. So I just think it's an easy transition to go from, you're in the system, and it's notable to you as a young person. You may not understand it all, but you get the fact that you're in the system and the consequence that it's different from a family.
Right.
And so transitioning, I think drug addiction, or at least experimentation, is really common. And then I think the transition to criminal justice system is one that, for me at least, was seamless.
Not to mention, I would imagine, a very strong sensation of rejection.
I think that goes exactly, and I believe that's why the numbers are that way. And I know, in media, in recent years, you guys are probably familiar with this, the Correctional Service of Canada, their custody rating scale. The Globe and Mail ran a series on that about how it was systemically racist. And I run those custody rating scales with my clients so that I know what's going to come out when they're sentenced. So I have the custody rating scale that they use. It's in the commissioner's directives. And ultimately, I would agree that there is a systemic racism, but I would also say that anybody coming from a poverty or child welfare background, regardless of culture, nationality, anything, is certainly open to being classified far more harshly than somebody coming from a normal or nuclear family.
I see.
I think it's also a simple matter of resources as well that lends its hand to that. I think we're first and foremost divided by socioeconomic class and status rather than race, gender. Those things of course are important and they make a big difference. But
custody rating scale, just to be specific, there's areas that talk about street stability. There's areas that talk about whether your family circumstance, employment, education. So everybody coming from that background tend to score really low. So yes, that really.
So Lee, can you tell us, what your first experience with the criminal justice system was like, with the police and the criminal justice system? I really want to get your opinion on judges, lawyers, crown attorneys, police, because for someone who's, and we'll get into, I do want to discuss eventually, all the different institutions you've been to and all of that, because I think that's super interesting.
I don't think we have enough time, but
but yeah, can you tell us your first brush with the criminal justice system and how it affected you?
Yeah, I can. So this was right at the tail end of my failed adoption, and I think probably the catalyst to it ending. I was 11, 12, somewhere in that neighborhood, and I had my keys to my home in Scarborough taken away from me for being in trouble. So even though I lived 2 minutes from my school, I was unable to come home for lunch, and I resented that. So I would come back to my home, break in, and I became accustomed to breaking into my own home, and I became quite good at it. I was able to cover my tracks, and because but it's a process. You get caught the first few times, and you learn how to not get caught. But that led to breaking, unfortunately, into other homes in that neighborhood as well. And I was looking for things like alcohol, Playboy books, like kids stuff at that point. And I ended up coming across a set of tickets for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and had concocted that a friend of mine had invited me to go, and I told a friend that I had conversely that my parents had provided these and were invited, and we ended up in the gardens, and not surprisingly, 15 seconds after sitting down, there was two TPS officers and it was season ticket holders, and again, I wasn't really, I don't think, intended for a career in crime, because that was an example of a very, albeit young, not a good move.
How old were you at that time?
12.
I guess you don't really think about that too much when you're 12, right? You just want to watch
I have to say my first experience, though, was fairly positive. I was talking to the Toronto police, and, they were, I guess, mindful of my age. It was also kind of a different time than now.
Yeah.
And they were just trying to say, look, what you did was you shouldn't be doing this, and da-da-da. There was almost a fairly positive messaging to me to say, this is not the way to go. And I had what I felt was a positive interaction there.
This is what, the late 70s, early 80s?
The early 80s, yeah. I mean, it was a different time, right?
Yeah.
And it was pre-technology, social. I mean, just
It was
time.
very informal. Is that what it was?
It was. I mean, I was allowed to go home.
Did you get arrested and charged at all? Or?
I got arrested. At the time, I was bullshitting. I said, I bought it from a scalper. Now, my friend said I had the tickets. They didn't push it too hard. They looked at the map. There was a map that they had, and I recall that. And there was a bunch of pins in this neighborhood that was right around where I lived. And somehow, surprisingly, there was break-ins all around that area, including where the tickets came from. So they did let me go.
Wow, you're talking about a physical map with pins
yes,
to
a real map,
indicate
physical map
where the
with red thumbtacks. This I recall.
Amazing.
And they allowed me to go, and I went home, and without even calling parents, which was very odd when I think about it now.
Yeah.
I couldn't sleep. I was terrified, and at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I went to my mom, my adopted mom, and woke her up and said, "Look, I did these things," and before I knew what was happening, she drove me to I think it was 42 Division in Scarborough, and marched right in and said, "My son has something to tell you."
Oh, wow.
That wasn't a fun experience. But again, I did not have that terrible feeling with the police officers. They were humane. There was a humanity there. There was almost like a teaching moment, I think they felt there was for me as a young guy.
Was there other experiences that ended up having you have negative perceptions of police later on in your
Throughout the years, I had an occasion one time where I had my ribs broken
by the police.
Yeah, I was. It was a really excessive arrest, and I had the "I can't breathe" moment. I could really relate to that. I had broken ribs, and they were still on me, and I was face down. And I recall believing that I wasn't going to make it through that moment.
How old were you at the time?
At that point, I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
So it was in the early 90s.
And what was the crime they were arresting you for?
Well, they had information that I had stolen through a break-in and enter 30 handguns.
Jeez.
Yeah, so that would have been a serious thing.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I was never charged or convicted.
Ultimately. Wow.
Not only not convicted, but not charged. It was the information they received was inaccurate, but they didn't know that, and they took it as serious, and they thought I may have some. So I've had the benefit and the luxury to, and this is really helpful in the work I do now, to not fault correctional officers, police officers, judges, defense lawyers, for anything that brought me to jail. I had this awareness that it was my actions, and I was always aware that I could potentially be arrested. I was doing criminal acts.
Yeah.
So when that happened, I never viewed myself as a victim, and I never viewed it as unfair. I saw it as part of what I was doing, and that it was a potential consequence. And I think that allowed me and allows me today to do what I do effectively, because I don't carry that with me.
Of
So
course.
were you ever adopted again, or was it that?
Nope.
Okay. And when was the first time you were incarcerated?
I was in 311 Jarvis at 15
Yep.
For a brief shot.
That's for our listeners. That's the youth court that deals with the Youth Criminal Justice Act.
Probably much different than adult jail, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I got to say, when the Young Offender Act came in, I had two experiences. So the Young Offender YO Act, the first one came in I think it was 84. I had been arrested in 83 and gone to the Toronto East as an adult at 16. And then I was arrested in 84 and went in as a young offender. And so I had a pretty good vision of both those things.
You must have ran that jail.
Well, the irony is, it was good fortune for me having done adult time.
Yeah.
Because I had this, stature. But I'll also say the young offender time, they were a lot more, they were more, it was tougher because they wanted to emulate what they thought was adult time. And so there was a lot more posturing and
intimidation.
Yeah, like they thought they wanted to be big time, and whereas the adults, they were, and they didn't, it just was a little more laid back. So I actually noted that difference, that it was like Roy McMurtry today is crazy compared to some of the penitentiaries.
Oh, are you referring to the inmates, or are you referring to the disciplinarians, like the corrections officers?
I think it's the other youth, right? That were trying to act so tough that they acted more tough than the adults.
It's the posturing.
Yeah.
And, often it's born from fear. You said something, and I don't think I followed through on the thought, the alienation. This is a very common theme. And you're bang on. That's what leads you down that road, or what makes it easier to fall into that trap when you feel you don't belong and you're alienated and you have no place. You just don't feel it. And you were saying that about the child welfare system, and I think you raised that, and I didn't answer it. But that was, when you said it, it hit home, and it's exactly what happens.
Yeah. And so when was the first time you were incarcerated?
So I had the brief shot at 311 Jarvis when I was 15. At 16, I was probably a week or two post 16. I was in the Toronto East Detention Center.
Yes.
And after about 60 days, and it was for break-ins, it was pretty consistent. I was stealing in those days. After about 2 months, a couple who ran a group home came to see me to see if I'd be interested in going there, and I did. And the couple's name was Fran Cap and Don Bowl. They ran a group home called Gothic House, which was a really an alternative type approach. They didn't have locks on fridges. Most group homes and foster care homes and that will lock fridges. So food is something that you're not allowed to access. They'll have restraints, and they still do to this day for young people. They didn't do any of those things. Their main mantra was home and safe. So unlike a lot of other places, if you came home and it was clear you'd had a few drinks, they didn't call the police right away. They let you sleep it off. They dealt with it the next day. Home and safe was most important to them. Whereas most places, if that had occurred,
one strike and you're out, basically.
It would become criminalized.
Yeah.
So, that's a key thing. Now, I note all that, and I get into that in as much detail as I do because Fran Cap, I ran into her 30 odd years later when she was an Ontario Ombudsman investigator. And for the last 6 years, she's now working for me as my vice president of Canadian Prison Consulting.
Wow. Wow.
We've come full circle. Yeah. That's my story of pay it forward or restorative justice. It's a really nice.
So Lee, how old are you now, if you don't mind my asking?
1,000. 54, and I had to be reminded of that. I don't know if it's me, but when you get in your 50s, you just kind of don't pay as much attention.
So when was the last time that you were incarcerated? Because I read somewhere that you have spent in and around
30-something years?
20 years, I think, 20 some odd years.
That's why I say I'm 1,000. No, but I my sentence, I can say that, and it's
I'm really curious to know, how many convictions do you have, if you mind me asking?
I could have brought that, but I have approximately 100. This is a federal inmate identification card.
2003.
Well, that one is.
Yeah.
So, but everybody who goes into the federal system is given one of those. And you have to have it on you at all times. And if you're on parole or statutory release, you have to carry that with you.
Okay.
Now, this one obviously has expired, and gratefully so.
Yeah.
But I often show this to my clients. It's a good visual tool.
Yeah.
My sentence began in 1986, and warrant expiry was early 2010.
Wow.
Wait, you were in consecutively between 86 and...
Aggregate sentence.
Wow.
So many failures, failures.
Yes.
Not always with new crimes, maybe sometimes just parole violations.
Got it.
But yeah, 86 to...
That's how many years? 86
to 30 years almost.
Well, that's 24 years.
That's 24 years. Yeah.
Wow.
So what was that sentence for?
I still debate this. I have a friend who's, I have very few people that I've stayed in touch with from my old life. But I have one guy who I helped get out, who's a lifer, and he's been on parole now for 16 years without issue, serving life. So, and for anybody who's uncertain about that, life is life, and parole lasts until he's dead. And so if he ever screws up, he's back in. But he's been doing well, and we joke a little bit about how I used to lay claim to the longest sentence for a property offender in Canada.
Yeah, because I do remember reading that the vast majority, if not all of your offending was also property offenses.
99 out of 102 were all property. There was a possession of a firearm at one point that was obtained through a break-in.
Okay.
And then there was a sale thereof. So those are the two exceptions. Oh, there was one charge that was related to use of a firearm in the commission of a crime, and I got to tell you, that was a day that still stands out in my mind. It wasn't the smartest move I ever made. A break-in that was going on, a gun had been found, and then there was a postal strike at that point. And that day, the Canada Post started delivering again. The same postman who had been delivering to the home I was in had been doing that route for 20 odd years and noticed something strange about the home and called the police. I was in there, and then I noted it was backing onto a golf course that all of a sudden there was police all around where I was. And I flashed the gun, which made them duck and go, and I ran away, and I made it away. But that was my use of a firearm in the commission.
Wow, I'm surprised. I feel like they were more likely to have shot you in the past than they are now, right?
They were very clear to my former girlfriend, and after that they had that thought as well. They did not like that I had shown that did not go well.
Did you point it or just show it?
I'll have to say that if I were in their shoes, I would say that I would have felt as though it was pointed.
I see.
Okay.
Wow.
That's
From
nuts.
my perspective, it was above and it wasn't at, but I think that's nitpicky, and if I were them, I would have not been happy either.
So Lee, so can you explain, Lee? I'm just curious about how do jails and prisons work? Like for the second you walk in,
really
right?
poorly.
That's for sure. But in sense of, there's an intake, and then you have you get assigned to a range, you have a cellmate. Like, how does all that, can you kind of explain that for the people who are listening who've never been in jail?
Yeah. I've been a real proponent for intake and for filtering and for doing their homework and compatibility and taking all these things into account when people first enter into a jail.
And so just so that our listeners are also aware, intake is the process that takes place when an individual is first arrested and they enter the system.
Correct.
And these days, it's a much lengthier process for the penitentiary. If you're going to the pen, your intake process can take up to 4 months. But if you're going to jail, I'm not even sure if there is much of an intake process anymore.
There isn't in the Ontario provincial, and I think it's really noteworthy. On any given day, you have 8,000 to 9,000 inmates in our Ontario provincial system. We have 25 institutions. It's a big system.
So jail, that's jail,
provincial jail, and then federal prison. You're right, jail, prison.
Yeah.
On a given day in the federal system, Canada-wide, there's 12,000 to 13,000 inmates incarcerated. So Ontario provincial is
that's
is
huge.
comparable.
Huge.
It's really big. Yeah.
Wow.
But 40% of Canada's population is in Ontario.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's indicative of, but still, it's a massive system, and it's really dysfunctional. There are a lot of good people that work in it, but so intake is, they've made they're in the process of looking to roll out implementing minimum, medium, maximum areas of our provincial jails. How long that will take, I don't know. I'm just really thrilled that they're actually acknowledging that would be the way to go.
Yeah.
Because right now,
pushing that agenda.
Because right now all the jails
Supermax
are just
across the board.
supermax everywhere, right?
Really?
Even if you stole a chocolate bar and breached a bail or whatever.
But they've got, from what I hear from my clients, they just have different segments or ranges, right? They got the special handling unit, then they have places places where.
Well, they have GP, they have
General-
PC, they have step down, which is kind of in between the two.
Yeah.
They have SHU.
So let's explain what each of them are. So GP is general population.
General population.
PC
and then
is protective custody.
Then your
SHU
step
is-
down is between the two. It's kind of an area, a gray area in between. So,
Okay.
and then the SHU is a special handling unit. And SEG still exists.
The segregation. Okay.
And, you know, strangely, even though I am a very much an advocate and a reform-driven person, I am not in agreement with the 15-day cap.
Which is what? Explain that to our listeners.
Well, the UN and the presently the Correctional Service of Canada has been forced to eliminate segregation for longer than 15 days. Also, all jails and prisons in Canada. There's been court decisions that have limited the use of segregation to 15 days.
And you disagree with that in what way?
So the UN has always said that it's a human rights violation to be in segregation or solitary confinement for longer than a 15-day term.
Right.
Adam Capay was used as an example of someone who had 4 years in solitary, if you recall. That was a big case in the
That was out in Sudbury, right, or something?
It was North Bay.
North Bay, and he got charges were stayed as a result
conditions,
of that.
no question about it. But what is often forgotten in that is what led him to be in isolation was the alleged murder of another inmate in that jail. And it's not uncommon, and I've lived a lot of decades and had familiarity with this. When an inmate is charged with murdering another inmate, generally the court process plays out while they're in segregation. And I don't disagree with that. I can say that from my experiences, I've run into people that I believe should never be released and that they would be dangerous to have out here. Can
you give an example of, not obviously the person, but like their mannerisms and attitudes?
Yeah, so I can think, a handful of people come to mind right now that have killed multiple, as many as half a dozen inmates throughout their term of incarceration already.
Oh, wow.
So every time they end up having a drink or something that goes on, they end up stabbing somebody to death. And then, or burning a cell out. I mean, these are just really violent people. So
this is alcohol is available to inmates at times?
Well, it's not. I mean, but it's certainly where there's a will, there's a way. And there's brews, there's shine, there's all these different things, and more so in the federal system. But provincial, they make brews as often as they can. They're always trying. I mean, subculture is subculture, and it's not going away.
And I imagine that's usually because inmates are there for a longer period of time in the penitentiary than they are the reformatory, and they have more time.
Let it ferment longer.
Yeah, but also the other part about the federal system is you can be there for forever.
Right.
So there's distinct differences in a lot of things. It's a small town, and it's driven by inmate labor, and it's in many ways a microcosm of the world. When you look at this, it's, everything that's done within a federal penitentiary, painting, electrical, snow removal, any type of work you can think of or infrastructure upkeep is done by inmate labor. There's a staff boss, but they run the prison in that regard with everything. Also, when you're there for potentially forever, you're entitled to a small amount of personal belongings that you're not entitled to in a provincial jail. Right. So in your cell, you would have a TV, an alarm clock, a watch, some of your own clothing. You have more along the lines of shops where you can do productive use of time. So like Corcan is a traded entity, Corrections Canada, where they build things like lockers and
like metalwork and stuff like that, woodwork.
Well, that's provincial, but in the federal. But they're just it's a lot more like a normal community and a very small community, and it allows the opportunity to earn your way forward. But it also gives you a little more rope to do things if you're not inclined to move forward.
So can I ask, obviously the federal system is
open visits as well.
Right.
So what's an open visit?
Well,
Is
that
that
means
touch,
that
is that like a touch
your
visit?
family can come in and you can spend a day together, and you can hug, you can kiss, you can just hang out, hold hands.
Right.
Is
as
that like a
opposed-
conjugal visit?
No,
or-
that's just a normal visit.
Okay.
And then the conjugal visits are there also, which are 3-day, 72-hour durations, where you have a little home, typically a trailer, with a kitchen, living room, bedrooms, backyard, barbecue, and your family can come in. And it's
Yeah.
very important for keeping
Yeah,
families
of
together.
course.
Yeah.
But it does allow more opportunity for contraband and different introduction of things
Right.
than provincial does.
So what I was curious about is when we're talking about the penitentiary, we're talking about a federal system. It's publicly funded, obviously. And so
Billions, yes.
when you're talking about, being gainfully employed as an inmate,
Mhm.
can you give us, you said, so there's some metal work that they can do, etc. Can I ask, is it that the work is also all public, or are there any private institutions involved?
There has been historically, and I can think of Fenbrook, which is Gravenhurst, the medium security. It's now called Beaver Creek Medium, but where they had a contract in for a telemarketer. So there was a private firm that had a contract come in there. Now this is not, it never expanded and it didn't grow and it's no longer, but there has been a birdhouse maker. I remember again in that same institution where it's a private firm, and
Right.
inmates were making a profit sharing or a minimum wage. I can say that the Harper tenure, and especially when they got the majority in 2010, all of that went by the wayside. All those positive work programs, the farms were shut down.
Wow.
Unfortunately, because it was one of the very few things that was a really productive use of time, allowed trades to be learned, and allowed somebody to come out maybe with a little bit of savings or to help their family financially while
Right.
they were in,
Right.
and allow them to have that degree of some self-value, and that they were
But the money earned is
kiboshed.
very little, though, right?
It's minimal. Part of what went along with that, I mean, I worked in the pilot program in Joyceville, which was the metal shop, and there was things made such as lockers, beds, military. At that point, and I'd say it was really helpful for me, the profit sharing ended up being $400 or $500 a month, which was considerable, because
Wow.
an average inmate's pay is at most $50 every 2 weeks. So that is the highest that it is presently.
Wow.
They say 69, and by the books, that's correct. $690 a day times 10 days, 2-week period. But you have deductions for multitude of things.
How many
cable.
hours do you have to put in
Full
to get
days.
your $690?
Full days.
8-hour shift, you get $6.90 currently.
But again, compared to provincial jails, there's no pay whatsoever.
Right.
So the people that are making our license plates are not getting compensated. So
That's basically a slave labor, right?
Pretty much.
it is.
That's what it is.
Fortunately,
It's
we haven't
indentured
come to the
servitude.
point where the states are, where they have a lot of big contracts that are done that
Yes.
way.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But yeah, it
Private
is.
corporations are
Yes.
the ones who are having inmates do work.
Yeah.
But you're saying here in Canada at a time prior to the Harper tenure, when there were some private institutions involved, it actually worked to the benefit of the inmates at the time?
It did. I mean, this is
Wow.
something that you had to work hard to earn, even being considered for that position.
I see.
So I always view, and this is where provincial jails are really lacking, and the federal system is ahead of it. Although we still need to do better. Vested interest is huge for an inmate, and especially if you're coming in. My view is, we talked about intake. Admissions and discharge is the department that all inmates are entered into an institution and released from. So this is the one area where people come and go all the time. Admission, A&D, it's called for short. If there was a strong intake process, 2 to 3 weeks, even a month of reviewing static information, looking at index offense, looking at history, criminology, all these different things, determining that somebody's a first-time offender in for DUI and somebody else is a repeat violent offender, you would come up with compatibility solutions. That would mean the first-time offenders would be in the minimum security area, and the repeat violent offenders would be in a maximum security area. But the vested interest, in in Ontario Provincial, we, prior to the birth of the super jails, which came under the Harris government in the late 90s in Ontario, we had medium, minimum, and maximum security institutions. So there was Birch Rapids, that was in the country close to Ottawa, maybe 45 minutes outside.
That was provincial?
Provincial. They made jam. It was a minimum security place. It was, you had Guelph, which was a beef factory, and actually they ran programming. You were able to make reasonably good money. You had Millbrook. That was where the license plates were made. That was a maximum security facility. But what made it work was when you were sentenced to a provincial term and your conduct...
And just to be clear, a provincial term is a term of less than 2 years.
Anywhere from 1 day to 2 years less a day, correct. Okay. But when you were sentenced to a correctional term in a provincial term, there was a vested interest to behave and to be compliant and to do your time well. You could go to minimum, or you could go to medium and make money. And conversely, if you acted up and you were not being compliant or doing things, then you would be maxed. Now, none of that exists anymore. Everybody is maxed, so there's literally no incentive. So anybody who's good and anybody who's completely acting up every day gets exactly the same thing.
I can't believe we're going backwards on really addressing prospects of rehabilitation. I mean, if you have no incentives, and
how does that work?
Right, and to kind of acknowledge that in the first instance, socioeconomic status and your inability to earn is what leads a lot of people into the criminal lifestyle and criminal behavior. What better way to reverse that than give them an opportunity to earn a fair wage and work their way through their punishment, so to speak, to either support their family who are out of the system, or better yet, even when have something to look forward to when you're released, so that you don't fall back into the same traps that led you there in the first instance.
Fully agree. Not everything you just said is bang on.
So Lee, can I just briefly, just because you mentioned minimum, medium, maximum security, can you explain the differences between three, like the privileges you get, just so somebody has an idea of...
in a really simple term?
Yeah.
Mobility, movement. So one of the most difficult things about incarceration across the board, from my perspective, is relinquishing control of everything in your life. That is... So we see movies, we see violence, we see all these different things, but I think the hardest thing is relinquishing control completely. Every day,
you're right.
You have no input on anything. You don't have input on when you get up. You don't have input on when you eat or what you eat. You've relinquished control over everything. You don't see family. You don't have access. I mean, just you've relinquished control. Yeah. So to me, that is the toughest thing. Minimum security, there's a lot more movement. There's a lot more ability. You're locked down seldomly. You are able to come and go all day long. Medium, the movement is tighter. Over the course of a day, you would have changeovers every hour that would allow you to go either to the gym, stay out for a shower, or in a common room area. But on the hour, every hour on the hour, you would have a 10-minute period to determine where you wanted to be for the next hour. Maximums are far more restrictive and locked down almost consistently, and your movement ability is reduced considerably. Also, maximums have far less in the way of programming or work or productive use of time. Mediums have more, minimums have quite a bit more. Minimums have things like, and we're talking federal here because right now provincially there is none of that. But in a minimum security, I was part of what was called Bush Gang in Beaver Creek, which meant we were going out every day and doing community volunteer service. We were working in a dialysis park. We were helping them restore and rebuild things there. We were cleaning highways. We were doing things that were positive, giving back to the community. This is a key. And minimum, again, there's smaller most minimums are 8 to 10 men or women in a unit with a kitchen where they cook food. You order food, you cook it. It's all done internally. It's on a per diem, but you cook your own food as opposed to getting it whatever off the line. So less people, more privacy, more movement in the minimums, and very restrictive the higher you go in security.
So are people assigned as like the cook? Like if they cook really well, does someone do that? Like
it does.
Is there like a little community like that?
Yeah,
where
it does.
people are
It tends
assigned?
to work that way. There's people that like to cook. There's people who are good cooking. There's people who are. I was never a big fan of cooking, but I tended to be fortunate to be around people that were. But I would do dishes.
Yeah.
So you cooked, I'll clean. I mean, we domestic stuff.
Yeah.
So
for
just
sure.
so that there's some terminology clarification here for the listeners, you have a range which is,
Living area.
right, and then you have the units,
Yep.
which are comprised of jail cells and some common areas.
Right. So I'd say a living unit and a range are synonymous.
I see. Okay, and then you have common areas like that,
and also known as a pod.
right?
So-
Yeah.
And then you also have the cells specifically, which are equipped with just a bed and sometimes a toilet.
Yeah, well, in the provincial, it's brutal. It's very austere.
Yes.
So concrete, steel, mirrors aren't mirrors. They're these things that do give a reflection. It's like an aluminum. I
Right,
don't
but
know,
they can't shatter.
You cannot.
Yeah.
Mattresses are an inch thick at most. There's no pillows. I mean, yes, this is a provincial jail.
Right.
Double, 2 to 3 men per cell.
Right. And just so that they're aware, lockdowns refer to the times where you are confined to your personal cell only.
Yes.
Okay.
With either 1 or 2 other men
Yes.
in roughly a 10 by 6 area with 2 beds, 1 on top of each other and 1 on the floor right beside the toilet. So that's a mattress on the floor.
So
And
when
is
we're
there
talking,
some type of hierarchy with who sleeps where?
Yeah, so I've put out a book, and I meant to bring a copy to you guys and all at some point, but this is dating back
Would
to
love to have it.
2014.
Yeah.
But it's not, I talk a lot about legislation. I talk a lot about the changes throughout the years, and I go back to the 1800s and right through. So the 1930s were a tough time on corrections in Canada, 50s. The 70s, there was riots, there was deaths. Then the Harper era, I touch upon that quite a bit. But when you're saying the lockdown, yes, you are, and right now our jails are really, really suffering, just like long-term care homes and hospitals. Staffing with COVID has been reduced to at most 30-40%. Most are home, most are unable to come to on site, which has resulted in lockdowns for weeks upon weeks.
Right.
And you are 3 people in one 10 by 6, day in, day out, no shower. A lot of my clients right now are going as much as 5 to 10 days in between showers.
Yeah.
No clothing change.
That's
I've had clients that go months without a clothing change. No visits.
that's a human rights violation in and of itself.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's a challenge, and I have a hard time being critical of the frontliners. I think they too are burning out, just like hospital
course.
people. They've been on the front line since the onset of the pandemic. They're now getting hit with this congregate setting. You've got 1,000 people all in one building.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. I just think it's time that we need to look at some
And
alternatives to incarceration in as many cases as we can.
And just so that we're clear in terms of what causes a lockdown, I think there's several things that can cause a lockdown. One of them would be, actions of particular inmates, specifically if there's safety concerns, if there is some sort of a weapon found and they need to do a search. Things of that nature could oftentimes lead to lockdowns. And lockdowns, like we said, are being confined to jail cells, sometimes for as long as 22 to 23 hours in a day, which
Or 24.
24.
which is
yeah.
insane. And then on top of that, you have lockdowns that occur which are completely outside the control of the inmates when
Absolutely.
you have staffing shortages.
Short staffing.
Right.
So lockdowns breed lockdowns also. So that's the other part of
Of course.
you've gone now, just visualize this, you've gone 7 to 10 straight days in a 10x6 with the same 2 other faces, and you're having to share a toilet in that same proximity with no privacy as well.
Right.
All the different things that domestically, I don't care how close you are to somebody or how much it's enough to test your patience.
Yeah, you begin to get frustrated, of course.
You know, a husband and a wife, I think, would be hard pressed to endure that. But so, I mean, it is really tough. And then when I say lockdowns breed lockdowns, after 10 days of this straight and the frustrations that are mounting, all of a sudden you're told, okay, the entire range has 1 hour to go out, grab a quick shower, make a 2-minute call because you got to divvy it up among 40 guys or 50 guys. And at the end of that hour, when they're saying time to go back in, they're saying, fuck you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not going back in.
I think I want to shower.
I haven't showered yet. I haven't had a chance to make a call yet.
Yeah.
And then that escalates really quickly because we have come to the point where frustrations have just, the last 2 years in particular, it's just a really heightened hypersensitivity on both sides. For
sure.
And frustrations.
You know, the number of times I have to tell the court, I make an order or do something because I can't even get instructions from my client. I can't even prepare. My client that can't make full answer in defense. They can't mount a defense because I don't have access to them. They're not given phone access.
They don't have access to disclosure, and they don't have. You cannot even. I've had counsel of late that have attended the jail 2 different times in a row, refused to see the client.
Yes, that happens to me all the time too.
And then at that point, the client's not even able to call. They haven't had access to disclosure. I mean, all these things are starting to really compound and become worse through Omicron has been, I think, the hardest hitter of all from the beginning of the pandemic.
I want to go back to one thing here, Lee. We were talking about, you were saying how the United Nations specifies that anything above 15 days is inhumane. When you're saying you don't agree with that, I suspect you mean that's too long.
No.
Or you're saying...
No, you're saying it's too short.
Okay, please clarify on that.
So, for the most part, I do.
Okay, because
But there are exceptions, like, for example, and I'll try to say this in a way that it may resonate. Let's say your brother or someone you love is in on a DUI, for example, and he's on a range, and your understanding is another inmate on that range flipped out one day and stabbed somebody and killed them.
Right.
Now that person has been in segregation for 15 days and is now being forced by legislation to be put back into population. And that's going to be your loved one's new cellmate.
Right.
I think that there'd be concerns that most people would have if that were the case. I think when it comes to something as egregious as a murder of another inmate, that there need to be an exception to the 15-day cap. I also think that if it's somebody who time and time again, whether it be mental health, and I know this is where it gets really difficult but every time they come out, they're violent. And they assault somebody.
Well, isn't there a reason for that?
There's sociological factors.
Right.
Okay.
So I read that of the 20 years and some odd months and dates that you have spent in custody, 2 years of that you spent in solitude.
Accumulatively.
Right.
And the longest street period was about 4 months, 4 to 5 months.
And what was the impact of that on you psychologically for serving a 4-month consecutive solitary confinement sentence?
Well, I was in Millhaven at the time, so I was already in a max. And I think I was conditioned. I was young. One thing about being young, there's a lot of things that I can look at now. There's an expression I'm fond of, and it's not partisan, but it's social viewpoints. If you're not a liberal in your 20s, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative in your 50s, you got no brain. But, when I look back at this, I was in my early 20s, and as I encourage my clients often, if they're forced to have to go in, view it as a sociological experience or an adventure. I mean, something that you can look back at years later, hold your head up, but know that it'll pass. Know that you'll make it through, and kind of do research and homework. And I turned it into something different than just wasted time. Is what I try to do, and I plant that seed if I can, to make it of interest as opposed to just, oh God, I can't do this, because we are resilient. I was young and I wasn't about to change at that point. And in some ways that was something that went on my resume that made me tougher, made my stature built. I spent 4 months in the hole in Millhaven. I was able to, I would pace, I would do push-ups, I would be incessantly doing that stuff. Anything I could get my hand on, I would read. I was an avid reader. I just knew somehow, and I had that ability I meditated. I learned that early on, and that was a huge part, and it's still part of my life. But I also knew the day would come when it would be over, and I had a mindfulness of that. I wasn't in for an indefinite period, and that's where I think you got a slippery slope. When people are in for indefinite terms, we have prisons in the States that are, for example, where Chapel is and all these other, but they're solitary every day, all day, forever, with no anticipated changes. I mean, that's super max, that's how they run. I was fortunate. I mean, I hit points where, and I think I discussed this at an interview one time, where there was a day where I ran headfirst into a wall because I was frustrated, and I had been told that I would be released, and that time came and passed, and there wasn't the cell space to release me.
So their solution was to just keep you inside
was
for
to
longer?
Continue to hold me.
Jeez.
Because I was eventually coming up on a release date that wasn't, so for a max, I was a short time guy, right? And I always respected that. I knew there were people doing life. I wasn't, and I was grateful for that. But I was frustrated because I was supposed to be out. They told me then I wasn't, and you can only sleep so many hours, and at that point I was trying to sleep my time away, and then I got to the point where I was over sleeped, and I remember being so frustrated that I did run into a concrete wall head first, thinking, if I knock myself out, at least I'll get relief from this, because I was starting to feel. So I had my moments where it was very challenging, but for the most part, as I say, when you're younger, you're more resilient, and at least for me, I felt like that was an asset.
And so solitary, just so that we understand, how does solitary work exactly? You're confined to a cell. They bring you your meals, and then are you escorted to go to the bathroom or have a shower?
No, you have a toilet,
right?
So, and you have a sink, and if it's running the way it should, you would get a shower every day, minimally every second day. Mm-hmm. You would have an hour. In
your own cell, or you would be escorted to the showers? Well,
so in Millhaven, and in a lot of these places, so for example, in Provincial, yes, you're escorted to the shower. But in Millhaven, it's a fairly secure unit, and they just buzz doors open. They don't key them. Mm-hmm. So your door is cracked, which means in the control booth, they open it. And there's nowhere for you to go other than the shower. That's the only other door that's open. You could go to another door and talk to somebody, but they could literally shoot down the range if they wanted to. They have weapons in the federal system, but yeah, you're allowed out, which makes it easier also for the federal system to facilitate those things, because it's not a double correctional officer required to come to the door, manually open it, bring you to a shower area. They just push a buzzer, your door opens, and so I think that simplifies the logistics of getting the showers done. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so you had the shower, and then we'd have a very small yard, but we could go out. Typically, it was every other day, and sometimes it would be every day. And again, this is going back to 1989, 90, right. And there wasn't short staffing.
Lee, I take it that the purpose of seg is so you're segregated from the rest of the population, meaning
it's a jail within a jail.
So you'd have no social interaction with any other inmates while you're in seg. Am I right?
So you're not in segregation, in other words, for your own protection. You're in segregation for everybody else's protection.
And that's the other area where I have an issue with the 15-day cap. There are some people who are so terrified that they don't want to leave the cell, and may well have legitimate reasons for that, whether it be known as an informant, whether it be drug debts, whether it be who knows what kind of payback for something.
Pedophile.
Yes, various reasons where I'm not opposed if that is what they want for their safety. And again, I don't think you should force somebody to get out of their comfort zone. And I know it sounds odd, but I've been there and I've seen it. And I can tell you at this point, I could probably draw what's called solitary time a lot easier than range time, because
Less politics,
you're
maybe?
safer. Less politics. You're
Yeah.
safer. So you have a lot less moving pieces and things that could potentially go off that you have no control over when you're in just a cell by yourself. As long as you have a lot of books and materials to keep yourself occupied, in some ways I find it far more settling than being in a range with 40, 50, let's face it, with very little to do and all kinds of stuff going on, fighting over a phone time, over what channel's on the television, the noise, so I can say from experience that there are examples, and like you say, police officers, pedophiles.
Is it true that those people, their lives are in danger? Like you always see it in the movies. For example, this guy ratted somebody out,
Yep.
or this guy did
Yep.
this. Are those people immediately, put in PC, or do they have to be careful? Like, is maybe Canada is different than the U.S. I guess too. I don't know, but
Well, what I can say is with technology, Google.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody that's coming in and entering onto a range, the moment they're there, somebody's on a phone having their person Google that name. They're going to know the second, within a minute you're on the range, why you're there. And if there's a publicity ban, that'll just bring more questions and more suspicion and a lot more questions. So yes, it's very much monitored. Inmates do that. They want to know who's around.
Is it like some kind of an organized system where the inmates there's like, I guess there's probably...
I'd say semi. Every range is made up of different makeup. So the book I did write, there's people that say, write a book on how to do time. I can't do it because every jail, every range, every region is different. Its makeup is different. If you go to Northern Ontario, you have a high percentage of Indigenous offenders, and it's a different makeup there. If you come to Toronto, you have a different makeup, a demographic.
Okay.
And every range is, depending on who's on it, is run by a different set of rules and a different, so it's very hard to really have a one set. You just have to be prepared to roll with whoever's the power of or the stature of. I think you referenced servers at one point, but they're generally the guys that have the most pull or experience or
the most respected or liked?
Yeah, respect, I guess you would say, on that range that tend to end up doing it.
Because that has to be selected cumulatively amongst the guards and the inmates. They're the ones that jointly nominate someone. That's what I was told by one of my clients. I'm not sure.
And again, that varies.
Okay.
So it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's so hard to peel all the layers off.
Of course.
I'll just say there is collusion at times. In a perfect world, when a jail and a prison's running as good as it can, it entails a degree of cooperation between staff and inmate. And staff always prefer having inmates in that position who are able to, in their own way, keep the range in line. And that's a key element of that relationship.
I see.
Now, that can also go sideways because that same relationship, things can be offered to, there can be collusion. And I've seen that play out before too.
Collusion between the guards and inmates, or?
For example, it's a sex offender, it's not in the news, but yet they end up taking a real beating and being told. And the only way they were that the other inmates knew this was because the correctional officer gave them the heads up. That guy is.
I see.
And to me, no matter what you think about sex offense or what you think about anything else, that is something that should not occur. That just shouldn't happen, but it does. And you just have to think of the proximity and the time, and it's human.
Yeah.
So take legislation and policy out of the window, because they're microcosms of the world, biases, personalities, all these things come into play, and they override legislation, policy.
I think it's a good segue to kind of get into what your company does and the services. But before we do, if you feel comfortable telling us, I think I did read that you managed to escape from Maplehurst.
I did.
Please tell us about that.
Boy, you found that, eh?
Yeah.
I haven't really published that much. Boy, it's a good story. I've written it, actually. I haven't published it, but
please tell us.
It was therapeutic for me to write.
It's therapeutic for us to listen to, too. And Maplehurst is awful. I'm happy somebody got out of there.
Again, when I say it's like the 1800s, I mean, when I look at what I was able to do, and that was in 1986, it was actually my entry into the federal system, because I was serving 2 years less a day. Mm-hmm. I was sentenced to 2 years less a day in 1986. And my placement was Maplehurst, and I think I'd been there about a month. But me and one other guy, and the other guy had cold feet at the end, and he didn't go, but he played a big role in helping me. And ironically, this same guy just reached out to me on Facebook a few days ago. I haven't heard from him in decades. But I mean, anyhow, it doesn't matter. That's neither here nor there. Maplehurst at that point was what I would consider a low medium. It wasn't like it is today. There was the DC part didn't exist. It was a CC only.
Yeah.
If you've ever driven by there, the yard was actually used in those days. There was baseball games, there was soccer games. It was different than now. It wasn't as tight. But the fencing was there, and we concocted, and again, this goes to show, I think, how much technology has changed. At the end of the range, there was a long thick steel railing embedded into a concrete wall on a stairway. We worked on that thing for about a week, and were able to get that long steel railing out of the wall. I was able to get it into my cell. And the cell.
How long was this railing?
7, 8, maybe 10 feet, roughly, like long. And so again, there wasn't a buzzer on this end wall. This is at the end of the range. There's a staircase that goes down, and it was a staircase that would bring us out to the yard in. But there was no alarm on that door. There was an alarm on the door going out to the yard, but not an alarm on the door from the range to that staircase. Mm-hmm. So it was probably about 8 to 10 feet. It was a lot.
Nobody saw you carrying this giant pole around?
You're very mindful. When you're in there, you become very aware of when the walks are. You have people who are posted at a vision point to see if somebody's coming. You're given an ample warning as to when you can... You can set it up so that with only a few people, you can have a pretty good communication system and know when they're coming, know when they're not, know when you can do things. But we were able to get that in, and the cells had, I believe, horizontal is this way, right? Vertical is that way? Yeah. So horizontally, and they're really pretty tight, but used that railing for hours on and off to wedge a hole big enough for me to slip out. That entailed also Vaselining my entire body and going down to boxer shorts, and I was a lot thinner than I am now. I wouldn't work today.
What did you pry the bars with? How did you manage?
With the pole, with the railing. With the railing. So again, this goes to show though how 1986 technology-wise, it was like the 1800s, because they just didn't have the cameras, they didn't have all the things in place, or the sensors that they do today, or the degree of security there. But yeah, I was able to do it. It took all in, it took about 2 weeks to do. And when it was ready to go, I shockingly Vaselined up in boxers, was able to squeeze my way out. There was a moment where I thought I'd get I wasn't going to make it through, and that I would end up being caught, like wedged in.
Imagine that explanation.
No, that would not have been good. And that gives you a huge amount of inhuman strength to, ironically, that fear of getting caught in that position. Yeah. So, and the other guy was pushing me too. So I ended up popping out and landing, and he threw out my clothing to me, and then he decided not to come. And I thought, okay, well, whatever, I'm going. And one of the toughest parts about that, beyond that, because that was in a way we were able to work it on and off, but there was chicken wire on that fence, and there still is today. And unlike barbed wire, chicken wire I found really tough. You can't, it's so tiny, you can't put your fingers into it. So I had to go under the chicken wire. I ended up tearing the hell out of both arms.
Wow.
A good 15 feet of chicken wire at the top, and finally made it over and got on the other side. And the long and short of it was, there was no cell phones, but there was a trucker on the 401. Maplehurst is right beside the 401.
Yeah.
And the trucker noted somebody on the fence and called the police, CB'd it in. And I ended up coming out, and all of a sudden you see a cop car, and I hit the ground, and I'm just quiet. I'm thinking, can't be me. There's no... And then there was like 6, 7 of them that ended up parking in that area. And my thought
like,
of it can't be me is... And I got into the police car. I got into the back seat eventually. There was another moment where there was a young female officer who was like shaking with a gun, and I'm saying, I don't have a gun. I was nervous because she looked like she was nervous. Yeah. But I got in the back seat, and they asked me who I was, everything else, and they called into Maplehurst, and Maplehurst said, we're not missing anyone. And they said, you better do a count because you are. But I had made it out if it wasn't for the trucker. Anyhow. That was
awesome.
My big escape.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that story, Lee. So I think it's a good segue for us to kind of figure out, or you tell us, in maybe in as much detail as you want, about what you do and how you do it, what your process is, who your clients are, the type of people that hire you.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to start with...
tell us about Canadian Prison Consulting. That's the name of your company?
It is.
Excellent.
Yeah. Canadian federal firm. I founded in 2010, which was coinciding with my warrant expiry date on my federal term. It was done finally.
Okay.
For the first time since birth in 2010, I was without condition. Because whether it be child welfare or criminal justice, I was always in one form or another. So it was my freedom. I did a lot of homework on this, and it's interesting. When I first founded it, I founded it as a federal corporation. And I opted to go that way because I did not want to be handcuffed. When I looked at some of the advocacy nonprofits, John Howard Society, Elizabeth Fry, different groups, they were reliant on government funding, and they could only go so far often with what they did. So I didn't want to have a muzzle or a handcuff on me, and I didn't want to be reliant on government funding. That was a key part of the thought process. I actually targeted one lawyer in Ottawa specifically that I wanted to see if I could make it work with, and that was Michael Edelson, who I had done a lot of homework on and thought was a pretty impressive fellow. And I set up a meeting with him, cold call, and ended up being an hour late. I had the wrong time marked down and showed up, and he told me, he says, well, we got 5 minutes. Turned into a far better meeting than that. I saw a real, through my experiences and towards the latter stages of serving time, I was what was called an inmate committee chairman in a number of prisons. And that is an elected position, representative position for inmate populations. It's vis-a-vis like a mayor, I guess, but you're mediating, You've got an office, you've got a computer, you've got a vice chair, you've got a vice chair, you've got a secretary, you've got a staff, and you're there to mediate. And also, at that point, I took it very seriously. I had a lot of criminal code books. I became very well versed with the Corrections Conditional Release Act, rules and regulations, the commissioner's directives. So I became a bit of a policy wonk through that. And I discovered that I was able to win a number of grievances when I thought they were meritorious for inmates in the federal system. And I discovered a bit of a niche for helping people prepare for parole hearings and running mock parole hearings. So this all developed while I was still inside.
Hearings before the parole board to determine their eligibility for early release?
Yeah, no. So the mock hearings were I developed what I consider a formula, and I call it my cornerstone still to this day. And I've mentioned them, I think, earlier: ownership, accountability, insight, remorse. Those are 4 cornerstones that are key for the people I work with. I can say inevitably in all the paroles that were denied that I've seen throughout my years, and every time there's a parole hearing and a decision, there's a rationale that's provided after the fact. So here's why you were granted, or here's why you were denied parole. The parole board puts forth their rationale. And inevitably, every denial pointed to one of 4 things: lack of ownership, lack of remorse, lack of insight, lack of ownership, accountability, lack of accountability. So through that, I realized minimizing and deflecting was obviously kryptonite and not the way to go. But I really developed what I understood was, for one, nomenclature, messaging. In some ways, and I don't want this to be misinterpreted because it's not entirely, everything by definition is manipulation, and manipulation is not necessarily negative. It depends on the intent, right? So, but I often reference in layman terms to clients when I first meet with them that I am like a very unique marketing firm, and I know how to market them, and I know what I need to do for messaging moving forward. And there are so many steps to this. So if you have a client who gets a federal term, whether it be 2, 3, 4, 10 years, whatever the case may be, I go through everything, including, and a really important part of it is within the very first week of sentence and entering into a provincial jail, there is what is called a post-sentencing community assessment done, and an assessment done with the offender. So within 7 days, when somebody's in a bucket, they just got 2 or 3 years, they're in a detention center, you've got a community parole officer who comes and does a preliminary interview with them. They also then contact their people on the street and their closest contacts and do a preliminary assessment with them. It's such a key point, because you want to have your messaging ready right then. Most people are unprepared for that first visit, that first interview, and often feel victimized. They can easily delve into, my lawyer fucked me, my lawyer sucked, this happened, that happened. They're not yet conditioned or ready for this interview. Right. So that is a really key moment that I've identified. The other things are, and I as discussed earlier, putting together support letters from, and this could be most of them, and again, I identify things like knowledge of the crime being the strongest letters, awareness of why they're writing this letter, awareness of what this person has done, but highlighting all the other positive things and giving the judge far more insight into this person beyond that crime, that day, that time. I find that important. Statement to the court, allocutions, really key for what I do. I work with people on their allocutions, and the purpose of this is any releasing body, any tribunal, Ontario Parole Board, Quebec Parole Board, or the Parole Board of Canada, the 3 in Canada that exist, always, by mandate, have sentencing transcripts. So therefore, are reading oral reasons for judgment. My job is to do as best we can to elicit positive mitigating comments.
And
at the sentencing stage.
Yes, at sentencing hearing.
And
it's so important.
who
Laying
are
the foundation.
Who are, for the most part, what's the demographic of your clientele?
So, this comes and goes and it changes, and I would say often I've had a lot of first-time offenders who are professionals.
Right.
I've had a lawyer as a client before who went in. I've had police officers who've gone in.
Mm-hmm. And you're advising them, I take it, post-sentence on how to best cope with being in custody?
Yeah, so that is certainly one component of it, giving them the internal fortitude to do that, to do time. I mean, that is, but I also think just as importantly is the strategic part of it and the messaging and the marketing campaign, as I call it. Right. And again, I often say that just because it's very layman terms, just to understand that this is a really niche thing. Right. There's a nomenclature on its own for this, and there's a, I don't want to call it a recipe, but what happens through this process, through the front end hours of consultation with them and their support people, I get a really good insight into who I'm working with and where they're at. And I'll tell you, without exception, and the people that are exceptions I don't work with, I just say I'm full and I can't take you. But everybody I work with is there. They get it. They sincerely wish there was a way they could go back and change what led them to being in this position. And they're determined and they're dedicated and they feel ashamed, embarrassed, all the things. Right. I mean, the recipe's there. So the one thing that I can point to that I'm proudest of in 11 years of doing this, I have played a role in between 150 and 200 parole grants over that time. Right. Not one has reoffended. The recidivism rate of 0. Wow. That to me is really, really important. And now of late, I've had some clients that, and some clients I take on in custody. So I go, and in those cases, I go for a professional visit, and I draw an hour to 2 hours, however long I need, to get a real feel, and I want to understand: are you sincere? Are you there? Right. Because this is important to me. I still believe what I do plays a role in public safety. I really do.
Of course. So can I ask? Let's give by way of like an example, kind of like a mock-up here. Yep. Let's entertain Marco Muzzo. Yep. Came to see you in advance of going into custody. Yep. So he's not been convicted yet. What just briefly, what type of conversation are you having with somebody like that?
Well, for me, and I've spoken actually of that case in the media, even though I didn't work with it, but I was asked about it. And I think the biggest important factor for me is the remorse. I'd really want to gauge that and understand it. I've not met him, and I don't know, but my thought on that is you can have a when we talk about biases and interpretation and the court of public opinion, which can come into this often also. So that's part of the marketing, right? In today's day and age, more than ever. But you could say billionaire, you could say, above it all and thoughtless, and many people have in comments. But the most important part from that case is there's no way in hell he ever visualized killing 4 people. Right. And all those things that you could be critical of and everything else, my God, I assure you he did not set out to do that day. Right. And for him, the key points, and I think his first parole could have been made, even with the court of public opinion, would have been based on, because they said minimizing and deflecting, and this is what I read as an after effect, and also, but ultimately just really, really highlighting how seriously he took it, and how when you look at if there was any way to go back in time and change, of course, any one of those things that led to what he did, he would, and that this really hit home. And how do you live with? Of course,
and those are like certainly considerations for getting early release or parole. But what advice would you give him about serving the actual time, if any? Or,
that you will make it through. That's always a really key point. Depending on how much time it is. So one thing I do, 10 years, right? I think that was the term.
Yeah.
One of the earliest things, if we know this is a joint submission, it's 10 years or whatever the case may be. And I've got a guy right now that's 10 years, and I've done the math with him recently. That's 120 months. 1/3 of 120 months is 40 months. 6 months off of that is day parole. So 34 months on 120 months is your day parole eligibility date. Right. That is a target. That right there, mentally, perspective-wise,
must have a huge effect on someone.
Gives you some light.
Yeah.
Then I talk about, okay, 34 months. And then I say, for example, where were you 5 years ago? And I go through this exercise of what were you doing, where were you, what was going on, and now today. And look at how quick that 5 years transpired, right? So again, 5 years from now, when you're looking back at this, you want to be able to look back at it and know that you did everything in your power, and know that you're going to make it through, and so that your life is not ending.
It's psychological coping mechanisms rather than go in there and make somebody your bitch your first day.
Yeah, go fight someone.
No,
you don't give advice.
That's not. Okay. But you'll hear people saying that, right? That's what you do. Yeah, go and hit.
It's like that movie Get Hard. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen
so
that.
Stupid.
Yeah. It's not really like that, is it?
This is notes I had that I took to a client recently. Boot camp opportunity, 3 years to accomplish as much as possible. University, reading. And I got my personal trainer, nutritional certificates. I got a diploma in psychology. These are things I did when I was in. So, just view it as an opportunity. In some ways, I think there are benefits derived. Connecting from technology.
Right.
It is monastery-like in that regard. You don't have this incessant stuff coming at you day in and day out.
Right.
So you can really actually do some spiritual stuff there.
Like starting a meditation practice, like you mentioned. Yeah.
You can do a great deal of reading. You can take school. There's so many things that you can do to be productive so by the time you come back, I think in many ways you have a greater appreciation than the average person. Today, there's not a moment that when I walk out of here and that sun hits my face that I don't take it for granted. I still, to this day, just feel blessed.
Right.
And I think that's something that I see lacking in a lot of people who haven't been through what I've been through, and I think there is an upside in that regard.
Absolutely.
So those are things that I talk about, and I talk about resilience. And until we're put to the test, we don't know, but we are humans, very resilient.
And you're living proof.
Yes.
That's the best part.
And if I can, anybody can. I mean, I'm no different. So that's, yes.
So I just, finally what I wanted to ask you, now close to the end of what I wanted to ask you was, do you still maintain connections with, or maintain criminals? Some connections, not with criminals, of course, but with the institutions and with other...
Absolutely.
Just a kind of, I'm sure there's a difference between kind of understanding how the institutions work from the outside versus understanding how they work from the inside. And I think for you to do your job, of course, it's beneficial to have both perspectives, right? So is there something that you do
I do. For one, I call it relationship building. Mm-hmm. I've got people in my life now that I consider to be friends. A security manager of a provincial detention center. He and his son, who just started as a CEO, I consider them to be friends. They're good. They're good people. They're fair. These are people who do it right. I've come to know superintendents, deputy superintendents. I've come to develop relationships with people. Part of it is I'm not an activist, and I'm not just saying corrections is shit and they're terrible and they do all these horrible things. I understand the nuance, and I understand that it's very challenging for corrections on a whole to do what they have to do, and I understand they often end up being, just everybody being very critical of how poorly it runs. I know it's not as easy as that. I am also a stakeholder in the federal system. I know the Commissioner of the Correctional Service of Canada quite well, Ann Kelly. I respect her quite a bit.
Right.
But when there is something that comes across for a client of mine, for example, a lifer who has a price on his head, I notify CSE before he even gets to the federal system and give them a heads up. And I have consent forms, and I say, here's somebody, and here's the sentencing transcripts, and this is somebody that you have to be careful with or whatever, they're appreciative of the collaborative cooperation.
Right.
Deputy commissioners, parole officers, professionally, it's a challenge because there are culture issues, and there are people who, I call it arbitrary authority, and
they just have the power and they're just using it without any purpose.
There's some really
reason.
bad examples. Now, I've had more good experiences than bad, but I've got a young man who's in a prison right now who is of a Muslim descent, and his parole officer, it was very clear, pure bias, flushed him down the toilet, made up information on his file. I was able to go to national headquarters with the CSC, have it cleared that this was erroneous, get everything up. But still, he's still being sabotaged because there's solidarity. You got to, again, corrections is built in a way where they're siloed. You've got frontline, you've got management, you've got administration, you've got all these different divisions. It's not just a unified force, unions, and then you've got this solidarity thing. So they back each other's play. They don't, there are challenges, and the biases and the different things again do enter into it.
But that's something that you account for when you're kind of advising someone.
You try,
right?
and certainly one thing I do share is I say that it's hit and miss, and you don't know. But ultimately, there is one recipe that works as effectively, and that is ultimately eat shit. And own it. If somebody says that's the most horrific thing I've ever heard of and what you did, and you say, yeah, it is. Yeah. Instead of, principle or whatever, but there are ways to minimize the damage, as I say.
For sure. If I'm ever prison bound, rest assured you're my go-to man. What I find the most refreshing about you is that you don't, first of all, you seem to have a lot of sympathy and empathy. You don't have this misplaced level of entitlement that everybody else has done wrong by you, and that you've taken ownership. You've clearly turned your life around, and I love that you talk about your first experience with police officers and how TPS it was a positive one, and how you even understand someone in your position. Certainly, we as criminal defense lawyers constantly point at the jails and we're like, this is horrendous, what are the guards doing, etc. And your knee-jerk reaction is, no, well, the frontline workers, they're having a hard time as well. It is an issue of resources. They're being told to stay home. That's a part of the lockdowns. So you have this all-encompassing appreciation for everything that's happening within our penal systems, and you're not quick to displace blame, and that's very important.
Well, thank you. No, I think that is the key. It's so easy to be critical. But I also have come to understand, too, that through not doing that, the relationship building is enhanced, and you end up having more influence.
Right. So for anyone that's looking to kind of retain your services, CanadianPrisonConsulting.com is your website. Is that correct? And your contact number is 416-595-9328.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Lee, for attending today. You're inspirational to a certain degree with what you've done, the knowledge. You're very eloquent, well-spoken.
Absolutely.
You're a very interesting person, and you've honored us by attending our podcast today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it very much.
It's been a pleasure having you.
You triggered a very short thing that I'll share with you.
Please.
With what you said about the well-spoken. CBC came to my office to do an interview 2 or 3 years ago. We did a 30-minute shoot. Everything went really well. I can't remember what the subject was, but at the end, all of a sudden, I could see all the parties from CBC, the camera. They asked me, "Do you have proof of your criminal record?" I was in a suit, and I was shocked. I said, "Really?" But I think that's just indicative of how we become so programmed that, oh, that's a criminal. This isn't. Or
right.
Yeah, he must not be smart because he's a criminal,
yeah,
right?
I can articulate. I mean,
smart people are criminals.
I could have been in a tank top with my tattoos out and everything else, but I chose to wear a suit. But I just find it interesting. And now I have a copy of my criminal record at the office.
And I think that's the point, right? I think you're driving that point home to the individuals who may be experiencing the same life experiences that you had, and you're living proof that it doesn't have to be that way. People don't have to always view you from that lens. That things can change and be different. So
that was the reason. Yeah, exactly.
A lot of respect for you, man. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
See you again, of course.
I think we'll go.